Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 42 of the Adam Makes Beer Industry Pro Podcast. Today, I'm excited to be chatting with Richard Preiss of Escarpment Laboratory. Before we get rolling, give me a shout. Let me give a shout out to our fantastic sponsors that make content like this possible. Starting a brewery is a big step. Blickman Engineering is here to help. Since 2006, they've equipped hundreds of nano breweries for success. Their new 3.5 barrel Pro Surface electric brewing system cuts maintenance and saves at least 30 minutes per brew day with a powerful under kettle heating element. From 1 to 15 barrel brew houses to keg washers, grain mills, Blickman has what you need. Ready to go pro? Contact Phil or Tom at ProSeries@BlickmanEngineering.com. Blickman Engineering is proud to be the equipment sponsor of this channel and loves to help brewers at every stage of their journey. This past week, I spent a little time with this next gentleman. Let's talk the financial side. Tracking and managing the financial health of your brewery is a primary pillar of success. I wrote this copy, by the way. Check out my boy David Lentz at Brewed Fiscally. This man has the industry experience and skills you need so you can focus on growing your business. Bookkeeping, fractional CFO support, financial management system design, business plan review, hit up your boy. Check him out at brewedfiscally.com or shoot him an email at david@brewedfiscally.com. He's good people. Like I said, I just spend a few days with him at the OCBA. But listen, ladies and gentlemen, this is not why you're here. You are here to talk to today's guest. Richard Preiss is co-founder and CEO of Escarpment Laboratories, a yeast producer in Guelph, Ontario. Richard guides the company's R&D efforts and acts as the connecting point between sales, laboratory, and production activities. Richard graduated from the University of Guelph with a Master's of Science in Molecular Biology and Genetics. Richard, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Well, let me tell you this. This is something I wanted to talk about before we went on air. And as I was going through the live read, I was starting to perspire like a little bit more aggressively. Please tell me that I'm pronouncing your last name and the city, Guelph.
Yeah, you nailed it.
Right. Good. Because I did dig back into some older videos, which is how I originally found you, was some of the 2020 content that Escarpment started dropping, some of the longer form video stuff. And it was really exciting. I loved it. And there's not a ton of video content on the pro side. And so to find the stuff you were doing was very, very cool. So we had mentioned, your master's. Was operating a yeast lab always the goal of your university studies?
No, I mean, I started school wanting to get into genetics of some kind, whatever, some kind of ambition, cure cancer. Sure. I don't know, but I took a class on microbiology in my second year of university, and just I remember this one slide where the professor showed, these are all the things that are made through fermentation, and it was like beer, wine, chocolate, bread, coffee, cheese, all the most delicious things in the world. And that's what kind of broke my brain. And I'm like, fermentation is going to be my thing. And just fell in love with microbiology as well, working alongside with microbes and figuring out what makes them tick. And I was able to, do some research during my undergrad and really just fell in love with yeast, fell in love with home brewing. Ended up moving in with a guy who was a home brewer, and he kind of taught me the ropes. So it was this kind of just series of coincidences that kind of led me to be doing what I'm doing, and really just falling in love with beer yeast and helping brewers with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, one of the things that as I move through my career, I always feel as if, man, I wish I could rewind. I think a lot of us wish we could rewind on some things, but I don't think I ever had, for a very long time, a good understanding of what I was bringing to the table and like what because everybody has something unique. They have some unique talent, some unique skill, some angle on something that helps them be effective in the workplace, right? So for you, with the fields you're in, what's a skill set or talent that you possess that you feel like has served you well in the industry?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, I think the skill that I kind of bring to the table personally for Escarpment as a company and for the industry is I'm pretty good at like synthesizing a bunch of different information and making it useful.
Sure.
Taking a barrage of data information and finding direction, finding meaning with that. So that could be many different things. That could be just raw science work. That could also be figuring out where the industry is going and where and how we need to plug into it and predict as much as we possibly can as a business, from the operational side.
Sure. And so kind of dipping back in, kind of merging those two things. So how soon after graduation and then the opening of Escarpment?
It's a blurry line. So after my undergrad, I went to grad school at the same university, University of Guelph. I kept, I was just obsessed with yeast, so I kept working on yeast, and had some great support to do that. And basically halfway through grad school, the company started alongside a couple other guys, my co-founders Angus and Nate. So the company was up and running before the time I graduated. So I was kind of doing double duty.
Yeah. So how did that work? Because I'm always fascinated when people are doing. So I was somebody that I got through. I got through college. I completed my degree, but there were definitely some ups and downs. I couldn't imagine being in a position or in a space where I was, kind of like working on, I guess, a side hustle, but also not a side hustle. How did you balance that?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I'm very fortunate. My long-term girlfriend and I, we both really love to work long hours. Like really, it's not a burden, it's not a problem, and that's the kind of thing that kind of carries both of us. We both have our own businesses. My parents were the same way. So I think part of that is just being willing to put in the time, right? With Escarpment starting up, the other co-founders, the other guys we were borrowing space from a brewery. So they would have to go in at night and, basically make the yeast media and propagate yeast overnight. And then my schedule would be, I would go in at 4 or 5 a.m. and package the yeast, do the QC, ship it, drop it off at FedEx, and then go into work at the university. But I worked pretty regular hours at the university. So yeah,
Sure.
that was definitely like a period of intensity, but we always find ourselves having those. We're 10 years in now, and that still is the case. Sometimes there's these periods where you just have to put in this extra work and be comfortable with it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because I've done some thinking on this and some talking with my buddies. I have a couple of buddies that have a little bit more of an entrepreneurial type spirit. And like for my folks and for their folks, they worked for a company, and they worked for a company for a long time, right? And you mentioned that you and your parents kind of did the long hours, and did they have their own companies as well, or their own businesses?
Yeah, they both did.
Okay, so what kind of hours do you put in, like week to week? And I'm sure there's probably some ebb and flow, right? Like I'm assuming winter is a little bit slower for you because it's a little bit slower for us in general.
Yeah, I mean we're actually just kicking off the busy season now because breweries have to make beer in advance of patio season.
Sure.
It's really is, it heats up now. It's the fall that's kind of slow. So that's when we do our strategic planning and budgeting and all that stuff. Yeah, I mean, my workload is honestly pretty variable, and like I'm very like lucky to be in the position that I'm in, because like I'm not super active in the day-to-day, physical operations. I have, I have responsibility to oversee that, but I do have a lot of flexibility as to how my time is spent. But I will basically do whatever needs to be done. And I think a lot of business owners struggle with like prioritization and time management. I'm no different with that. Um, but you do what needs to get done, and like I really love what we do. As a company, it really has to me, it has a sense of purpose. Helping to number one is we make yeast and we get it to breweries. We distribute yeast and we help them with their fermentations. And number two is this educational piece that comes along with that, of like actually expanding our knowledge and helping people make better beer. Both of those things are really rewarding to me, even if sometimes that means having to unravel complicated supply chain issues, or troubleshooting a really challenging performance issue with a customer. The yeast isn't working, and we have to figure it out.
So in your opinion, what don't people realize about the job you do? Or like, what's a misconception that people have about what you do? Like, I know for me on the brewing side, I remember somebody walks by and they're like, "Oh, hey, what are you brewing today?" And like, "Oh, we're not brewing." And they're like, "Oh, well, it must be nice to have a day off." And it's like, well, no, like, we're doing cellar work, we're cleaning kegs, we're filling kegs, stuff like that. But is there anything like that on your side?
I will say, like, all the important aspects of making and selling yeast have almost nothing to do with actually how you grow it. That's important too, propagation, but like inventory management, managing shelf life, managing quality control, like all of these other raw materials, supply chain, shipping, packaging. Like there's just so much complexity. There's thought that goes into every single aspect of what we do. And I think, sometimes people just see the yeast at the end of the day, as this singular thing. But, the people in our company that do this work, every single aspect of that product and that customer experience has been thought through, and there has been a lot of work put into it in the last 10 years.
Sure. What do you feel as if, what do you think helps to set Escarpment apart? This isn't something where I'm like, oh, like, hey, let's take a shot at another yeast lab or something like that. But every team has things that they do really well. That's just kind of their thing. What do you think is some of the things that Escarpment really excels at?
Education, knowledge transfer is super important for us. If anything else, because I can't fully divorce myself from the academic side. It's if I wasn't doing this, I probably would be a career scientist. That's not an easy job either.
Sure.
But I think it's really important to create new knowledge, and it's also important to teach people how to use that knowledge, and that is actually probably more important than the raw knowledge creation or the science. I think we're pretty good at that. Whether that's we do the hardcore scientific research that's published in journals, we do, but I think more importantly, we do try to put a lot of energy into helping everybody with understanding beer fermentation and beer yeast better. And that's where, the YouTube videos and all the blogs and all of the knowledge resources that we create are, that's the motivation is, we want people to understand this process better and in turn be able to make better beer and understand how to fix problems when things go wrong. And I think that's a strength for us. Like I honestly think we're in a leading position in that space in terms of education and knowledge transfer. Now it's harder to sell that, but that is always, part of our offer and part of the value proposition to customers is that if you're working with Escarpment, you're tapping into that directly. And, usually how I sell that is, well, you can see what we put out there publicly, but there's even more knowledge if you're a customer.
Definitely.
And I would say that's a lot of the gaps and inefficiencies with yeast and fermentation in beer does require, that kind of support. You can make the most amazing engineered strains in the world, but if you don't teach your customers how to use them, then you're kind of doing yourself a disservice. And that's no criticism of anyone else. I think, there's other yeast companies that actually do a fantastic job of innovation. And we have our own perspective on it. And I would say that's another strength. I'm not going to come out here and pretend that we're rolling out the fastest pace of new strains, but we do have our own strain development program with our own perspective on what we think is important to make available to brewers in terms of new yeast strains that offer different types of flavors, different types of efficiencies, or operational potential. And I think that's important. I really like that there's a number of different yeast companies that have different strategies to how they make yeast strains and how they innovate. And then I think another piece that's really important to us is community. And, the last thing I want as a business is to be so big that we can't have, it's great to be big, but I don't want to be so big that we can't have a direct relationship with our customers, because I think then you lose some of the magic of the craft industry if that's the case. Do I want to be a little bit bigger? Of course, but there's a lot of value, I think, to breweries to know that they have a relationship with the people that are in charge at the supplier and the people that have influence to support them.
Yeah.
Right. I have a lot of brewers that have my personal cell phone number, and they can ask me questions. And I actually love that, because if I know they have a question, that means that 30, 40, 50 other people have the same question. So I'm going to get on my soapbox on a webinar or social media and try to answer that question.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. And I do think the education, well, and clearly, so you and I are speaking from, we have two different types of pulpits. You know what I mean? With your educational background. And then I try to talk, like the experience stuff that I've learned through the years, a little bit of science here and there. But, I do think, I think one of the reasons why the people that enjoy my content is that I never say that I'm the authority. This is like, oh, this is what I've read on this, as, like I'm trying to do my research, I'm learning. And this is more like, my path as a brewer, right? This is what I'm doing right now, but I'm always open to change. I think people love when you do share information, right? Especially for those people, and maybe this is a little judgy of me, but I like brewers. I like brewers that there's nothing wrong with having a job in a brewery. If that's what you want to do, that's great. But I like having a beer with brewers, like people that like want to talk about it, figure it out, break it down. And like, yeah. Anyways, I think that's the really exciting stuff. You hit on something when you were talking about the education side that leads well into one of the next things I wanted to talk about. What are some of the persistent misconceptions or typical mistakes you find brewers make in their yeast handling processes? And I'm kind of tagging on this one. And I've what are some of like those old wives' tales about yeast, right? Those things, like those things that just won't die. Like there's no science behind this at all, but it's like these persistent nagging things that for some reason get lodged in a brewer's brain, and they still think it's a thing. But yeah, anyways, just your take on that.
Old wives' tales, common misconceptions. Number one, I would say is, and this notion exists pretty repeatedly this idea that you have to stress your yeast to get a certain flavor. It's kind of BS. Yeast stress doesn't taste good. Now, you can select a different environment, different food for the yeast, and that's going to change what types of flavors it makes. But I would never make the decision to stress yeast to push a certain flavor profile. I think that's really reductive thinking.
What are the strains that people tend to clump into that category?
Usually Belgians, usually any like flavor expressive yeast, which there's a bit of truth in there. If you restrict the nutrition for some of those yeasts or increase the temperature, you might get more flavor expression. But you are also always going to risk, if you don't supply enough nutrition, for example, or if you operate the yeast outside of its standard range of temperatures or pitch rate or whatever, you're always going to run the risk of off flavors as well, right? So stressing the yeast is a great way to get off flavors in conjunction with the on flavors that you're targeting. That's going to make you have to take way longer to clean up your beer or, just do a bunch of extra work. So, we put a lot of effort into understanding how do we control yeast flavor expression and how do we get that expression without stressing it out.
That makes sense because, ultimately you want to, especially on the commercial side, ultimately you want to be able to use those things over and over again. I don't think anybody wants to get a pitch of yeast, run a batch on it, and then drop it down the drain. You know what I mean? So kind of generationally, you want to be, that's one of the reasons, is because you want to be able to maintain those pitches for multiple generations.
Yeah, that's important too. If yeast stress basically causes generational trauma, like it's multiplicative if it persists. Like if the yeast is missing something or, put through some kind of stress, then that effect usually multiplies.
For sure. So speaking of yeast stress, this plays into the next question that I have for you. I said I've received many different answers to this question, but is it better to crash our beers from fermentation temperature directly to 32F or 0? That's right, 0 degrees C, or to do it in a more deliberate stepped fashion? Because I've heard, we want to crash. We want to crash this beer to get it to drop out so we can get it off the bottom of the tank as soon as possible. And then I've heard another group of people say, well, we have to step this down because if we can temperature shock those yeasts and they're going to excrete things that will be negative for the finished beer. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, for yeast health, I don't have any issue with a hard crash. We effectively hard crash yeast in our own production, in our own cellar. That's not really an issue. You can crash from 25 Celsius or 75 Fahrenheit down to 32 Fahrenheit, 0 basically overnight. That's not going to cause any stress on the yeast. In terms of beer production, it depends on what you're doing. Like there are, traditional lager practices where you have this gradual step down in temperature, but that's usually done in conjunction with a secondary fermentation, like starting the crashing before the beer is actually done fermenting. So the benefit of that practice is that if you're also spunding or retaining natural carbonation, well, as the beer cools down, that beer that can hold more of that CO2 because it's more soluble at colder temperatures. So there's a functional benefit to slow crashing a lager if you're going for like a spunding or a natural carbonation. In terms of yeast, I don't think that there's any real, if anything, slow crashing would have a drawback because the faster you can get that yeast cold, once it's run out of sugars, the better. It will have better viability and better longevity.
Mm-hmm. Now, when I was at the last brewery I was at, we did tank checks 365 days a year. And so there was always a temperature, a density test, a pH test. And it was interesting for me because I've tracked those things in the past, but this was the first time that I was in a place where there was a 365-day log of tracking these fermentations, right? And it was a production house, and so we had a lot of standard beers. We had a couple main beers that were going into cans, going out the door. You could almost just block out everything else and look at the pH column on that and track the pH drop, and then on the back end some pH rise, to know where you are at in that fermentation. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because in my mind, if to my understanding, in part that pH drop is something that is meant to help the yeast outcompete other competitors, correct? Or am I just flat out wrong on that?
Do you want the 1 minute version, the 5 minute version, or or we can do the 2 hour version if you want?
Be as concise as you want to be on this.
So yeah, I mean, I think we understand the fermentation curve a lot better, right? Sugars are being converted into alcohol, so that density is dropping progressively and then flat lines. pH curve is more interesting because, as you said, you start at a high level, goes down, and then towards the end of fermentation, it actually does rise up. And then that rise at the end can tell you a lot about what's going on in the yeast. What is happening when that pH drops is what the yeast is doing is there's a few different things. So it's consuming nutrients. A lot of those nutrients themselves buffer the pH, so they reduce the window of pH swing. So when the yeast consumes those nutrients, that window gets wider. So that alone can then mean that the yeast can drop the pH when it's fermenting. What it's also doing is that whenever the yeast is importing stuff into the cell, be it sugars, nutrients, whatever else, when it's transporting stuff across that cell membrane to break it down in this cell factory, it will excrete protons, which protons in solution, that's acidic. That's what drops your pH. So the pH drop of the yeast is then basically dependent on how much sugar is it consuming, how much nutrient is it consuming, how fast is it growing, so maybe based on the temperature or the strain itself. And then you're going to kind of bottom out at a certain level when the yeast has consumed everything it needs. And that pH bottom corresponds to when that yeast is at its peak of active fermentation, because then after that point, it's not growing anymore. They're just going to shift into fermentation, those cells. So over time, they might even export some of the stuff that they no longer need. And then that export of stuff, junk, can buffer the pH, which then brings that pH back up. And so in an extreme case, you can have yeast dying at the end and releasing all those things that they previously imported, which then brings your pH way up.
Sure.
So you usually see a bit of a rise, but like if it's going, more than 0.2, 0.3 pH from the low point, that usually tells you there's a problem with the yeast, and that will usually correspond to bad viability.
I was glad you clarified that, because the drift up that I was seeing would be like, 200ths a day or something as we're tracking this. Pardon me. But also, like, again, because it was a production house, we were never sitting on a tank for long. You know what I mean? Like, everything was well scheduled with its window. So, it wasn't like there was this massive creep up. When we do see that pH start rising up at a more aggressive rate, we can start to potentially infer that we are going to start getting some yeast dying and dropping some of those negative flavors into our beer. What are some of those flavors that are associated with that?
Yeast death, yeastolysis. I would associate, usually for yeastolysis, it's like a savory, like a mushroomy or meaty like flavor. Sometimes that can also come across as a little bit sulfury too, but usually sulfur is a sign of the yeast not having nutrients up front. Really, like more of that meaty vegetal kind of character.
Sure. Well, this is one that I've been wondering about for a bit, and I think you're gonna be able to understand where I'm going with this question. So if we need to bump some of the parameters around, we can have that discussion too. But I've wondered about this for a long time, because when I came up home brewing at that point, I started probably brewing in 2005. The yeast book came out sometime after that. But in that interim, at the time, I came up listening to the Brewing Network podcast out of California, and they had tons of great pro interviews with folks out there, and really from all over the place. But at that point, I was listening to a bunch of Jamil Zainasheff stuff, and he was one of the authors of that book. But at that time, they had the Mr. Malty yeast calculator, and so I would get my yeast. I would punch in the manufacturing date. I would input the density of my wort, and it would give me the starter size that I need, right? So I had always wondered about things like this, because I'd always look through things through that lens. So if I have a lactose and pitching rate hypothetical. If I'm making a 5% beer, and 20% of the density of that beer is composed of lactose or an unfermentable, the density of that beer is far greater than that of a typical 5% beer, because that beer is going to only be potentially like maybe 3% ABV if 20% of the fermentables is lactose. How do you calculate pitching rate for that beer? Would it be based simply on the grist and not the non-fermentables that you're adding? Does the additional osmotic pressure from the lactose necessitate higher pitching rates? And if you need to slide that original gravity higher or Plato number higher to make it be more real or whatever, that's cool by me too. But am I making sense with that question?
Yeah, I understand.
Okay.
Yeah,
well,
like
what's your thought?
Really, the question is, like, should you adjust pitching rate based on fermentability of the wort?
That's a way better question than what I just asked in about 2 paragraphs.
No, but you provided a specific case of lactose, but it also could be like a really high mash, non-alc beer wort too.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of the same scenario. And my answer is scale the pitch rate to the amount of work the yeast needs to do, right? Mm-hmm. If you've got a 15 Plato wort, but it's only going to ferment down to 8 Plato, well, then pitch enough yeast for fermenting 7 Plato wort. Sure. Right? Like it should be scaled to the amount of work it needs to do, because that remaining sugar that's not fermentable is irrelevant. The yeast isn't going to use any energy to deal with that. Now, mm-hmm. if your starting gravity starts to get really high to the point where osmotic stress is an issue, then you might want to include some additional cells in there just to spread out the work, because the osmotic stress is a thing. If you have really high sugar content, that will make the yeast have to do more work to basically maintain that balance between what's inside the cell, inside the factory, and outside. Mm-hmm. But in a standard gravity beer, just scale it to the amount of work the yeast has to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's I like that, and this has me jumping. I might be trying to jump ahead, because this is where my head goes with this. So I remember back in the day. I worked with a lot of dry yeast at the first brewery that I was at. And at that point, using the Brewers Association's yeast book, it is on the shelf behind me. They were talking about the fact that dry yeast needed to be rehydrated. And so what I would do is, I would take water that had been in my hot liquor tank at 180 degrees for 12 hours, whatever, into a cleaned and sanitized corny. And then I would cool that down. And then when that hit the appropriate rehydration temperature, yeast goes in, that whole process, right? So then all of a sudden, yeast companies started saying, no, just drop this stuff on top of your wort. It's ready to pitch. And that might be the actual marketing thing or whatever. That blows me away, because I came up reading that dry yeast pitched directly into a sugar dense wort, which is what I just said wort twice. that it would lead to 50% mortality. Is this, can you talk to me about that? Because was it wrong back in the day? It has something changed with what's happening right now? I would just be interested in your take on that.
Yeah. Rehydration. So yeah, I mean, all the larger suppliers, the really serious ones, which I would say is Lallemand and Fermentis, have done work on that to demonstrate the differences between rehydration and direct pitching. And the answer that both seem to have landed on is that with beer yeast, you don't really need to rehydrate. You can direct pitch, especially considering the typical gravities of beers being so much lower. Like the rehydration is really this kind of leftover concept from the wine industry, where that is really important. You do have to prepare the yeast for that osmotic stress of a 21 to 25 brix or Plato fermentation. So it can be something to look at for a high gravity ferment, and it does depend on the strain how well they are able to hold up to like a high gravity wort without rehydration. But at least in the case of both Lallemand and Fermentis, they've both produced really nice studies showing that it's not necessary and doesn't make a difference.
Interesting. I've got a few. I hit up a few brewer buddies of mine, and so this one is coming from my buddy Andy, who makes a lot of lager. Super passionate about it, and we're always knocking stuff off each other as far as that goes. And I'm actually going to interrupt his question with this one. He and I have done a lot of work with the lager brewing that we're doing. We'll take a yeast strain. We'll work with it at different pitching rates, different temperatures, and because we both very much came up in that mindset of, oh, we need to be starting this fermentation colder the better, and I am going to go Fahrenheit right here. But 48 degrees and just let it sit. 48 degrees Fahrenheit and just let it sit forever until it's done and it's happy and it's clear. Okay. But then with some experimentation, we found that those ranges seem to be a little bit more flexible. What's your experience with that? And it's probably strain dependent, but have you run into kind of that very old school notion of saying, listen, pitch cold and sit on it forever? Do you think there's elbow room around that concept?
Yeah, I mean, it is very strain dependent. So that's like number one. Lager yeast is pretty homogeneous, but there are differences between strains. Some of them will hold up to colder temperatures, like really cold temperatures, better than others. There are differences based on what temperature you pitch at or ferment at. I do personally like beers made kind of in the middle of the range most of the time. If it's pitched at 10 to 12 C, so like 50 to 54. That tends to, for most strains, work really well. There are some strains that work at colder temperatures. There's some brewers that ferment at colder temperatures too. That does start to limit, timelines and such. There's always this balance too between like how fast do you have to turn the beer around.
Sure.
There are also legit benefits to colder pitching if you have basically the time for a colder pitch or ferment. You will get lower ester expression if you're pitching at 8C, like 46 versus 50 versus 54. It can be subtle though, and it is very strain dependent. Like we have some strains that are quite neutral up to 58, 60. Others where like you're gonna taste that difference. Like 3470, the classic lager, like you really taste the difference between temperatures. Like that strain at cold versus a few degrees warmer, you probably will taste a lot more esters. So that's why a lot of really push fermenting that strain a lot colder. But there's other strains like the Augustiner strain, for example, we call it beer garden, where it will tolerate slightly hotter temperatures without, more ester expression. Depends on your targets. The other benefit of cold fermentation is you do tend to get the yeast producing more sulfur compounds, which take longer to clean up, but they can also be antioxidants, so they can make the beer more bomb-proof against oxidation.
Sure. Just a side note on that Augustiner strain, just from a personal beer drinker standpoint, what's your thoughts on that yeast? Do you love drinking beers made with that yeast?
Oh, it's my favorite.
It's my favorite too.
You gotta treat it well. Yeah.
I was wondering if that was like too leading, but I really do. I really do love it because sometimes I think we can get. There's nothing wrong with that super crisp, ultra clean beer, right? But I think there's some of the intangibles of that yeast just magnify malt in a way that I absolutely love. And that's just the way that one comes across for me. Like Hellas with that strain for me, that I just absolutely love. I just absolutely love that approach with that style. But what is it that you like about it?
That's exactly it. It's the ideal strain for Hellas. For me, it's the ideal strain for German Pils too. Again, treated right. Yeah, man.
Okay, so talk to me about treating it right.
Treated right, it will produce, to me, like the ideal level of sulfur. Again, you have temperature flexibility. Like I can ferment it at 12C and still get clean results, which is great because I have basically home brewing, so it's really hard for me to chill wort to 8. So being able to go in at 12 and get a beer that's not super estery is really nice. Again, treating it right, getting the nailing the nutrition. It does have some nutritional quirks. You have to really make sure that it gets the right amino acids and zinc and all that stuff. Because if it doesn't, it'll be overly sulfury and then it'll take a really long time to clean up. But if you can dial that in, it can land in a really nice spot on a very reasonable timeline in those German style beers. Great in dark lagers too, like you said, with malt. Again, the sulfur production is kind of this funny thing, whereas you get the right amount, it's a fantastic antioxidant and it will preserve those delicate malt and hop aromas. You get too much, it tastes like farts.
Sure. Well, and the other thing too is, it is so, for my experience, it is so easy to work with in the brewery. Like I can harvest pitches off of it so easily. It's robust, it's dependable. I just absolutely love it. The thing I was laughing about while you were answering was I was thinking, because when I was talking about that strain and leading into that, I was having this moment of, and it also tells you I guess how dearly you hold some of these ideas. But I'm like, man, I really love this strain. And then I'm thinking I have this first date feel, where I'm gonna say something that I really feel strongly about, but then I'm like, but I hope they feel the same way. So I'm glad you reciprocated on your interest in the Augustiner strain. So that leads me into my buddy Andy's questions, and there are a couple that'll dovetail very nicely with what you were just talking about. Andy says, acknowledging that this may be strain dependent, what are some best practices post-lager primary fermentation for sulfur reduction during lagering?
That's a story that's written at the start of fermentation. So
okay.
It's tricky. Your sulfur production is going to be dependent on two things. It's going to be dependent on the nutrition given to the yeast. In particular, is the yeast given sulfur-containing amino acids or the building blocks to make those? Because if it isn't, then it's going to synthesize those itself. That process is messy, and that means the yeast will make a lot of sulfur compounds, and that's typically how you get a lot of H2S, like that rotten eggs, farty kind of sulfur. And then temperature as well. So even independent of that pathway, yeast will export and create some SO2 sulfite, and different yeasts make different amounts. Cool thing about lager yeast is it does make more sulfite than ale yeast does, and sulfite production is temperature dependent. So ferment colder, get more. So that's also a great thing for lager. Great, real technological benefit of the cold fermentations is you get this natural antioxidants. Hydrogen sulfide is also an antioxidant, but it just doesn't taste as good. SO2 is more of that like struck match flinty character that when it's in the right level, in the right harmony, to me, that's what tells me like, this is a lager. This isn't bullshit. Bull crap, whatever.
Yeah. Oh, you're good. You say bullshit. You're good.
This is a lager. Like that's what it tells me. So the whole story is written from the start of fermentation. It's written based on yeast nutrition, pitch temp, etc. So it's important to look at those as the key factors because that's going to determine how much sulfur you get at the end of fermentation. And then from that point onward, you have a certain level of sulfur and sulfur compounds. And, I'm kind of simplifying it as H2S and SO2. You might have others as well, but those are kind of the big ones in lager beer and lager yeast production. And then the lagering process itself will change those. They will reduce because those compounds are not typically very stable. They will flash off, especially hydrogen sulfide. So those typically will flash off, degrade, etc. over time, meaning that the beer changes. So, what I always like to target if I'm, producing a lager and, what I've noticed when I taste, fresh beers and beers in process in breweries that I know make really, really good examples is you kind of want a pretty noticeable sulfur profile when that yeast is, by the time that yeast is crashing or like freshly crashed, freshly lagering. And then, you kind of want it to be a little bit more than you would like when the lagering starts, and then it'll typically taper down to exactly where it should be over that lagering period.
If somebody finds that they have a beer in the bright, well, it could be either. Let's say either in the fermenter or in a bright tank, and there's more sulfur in it than they want to have in it. Aside from time, are there any levers that can be pulled in order to speed up that process of the reduction of the impression of sulfur in the beer?
Yeah, you kind of have two options. You can scrub it. So that means basically bubbling CO2 through it and venting that. The risk there is that you lose other aromas in that process. The sulfur's these are very light molecules, very small molecules. So they will come out of solution and they are typically pretty quick to flash off, but you're always going to lose some aroma doing it that way. The other option is oxidize them, which is probably not a great option. You probably don't want to just like bubble oxygen through the beer, but there are chemical ways to oxidize a product. So, what some brewers or distillers or winemakers will do is they'll transfer the product through a pipe that has a little bit of copper in it. Copper will chemically oxidize whatever it is that's passing through. So kind of like that's an old, especially for distillers, that's an old trick of, pass the product through a hose with a copper pipe in it and you can scrub out that sulfur pretty effectively.
Yeah.
Again, it's going to oxidize other stuff. If you got dry hops in there, it's bad news.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that because that's always one of the things that I've heard is that you can just rig up some copper inline with that transfer. I think that's fascinating, but you bring up an excellent point. We're talking about, if you are talking about something hop forward, you're probably going to be smashing up the impression of that at the same time.
Yeah, it's always better to fix sulfur upstream proactively.
Sure. So we'll dip into a couple of things on that side. One of them is there is an increasing amount of discussion around zinc and where zinc goes in your process. I listened to a couple episodes of Craft Beer and Brewing, and they were talking to some folks talking about doing cold side hop additions to the point to where I believe there's some yeast labs now that are offering a sterile zinc solution that can be dosed into your tank on the cold side. I'd be very interested to hear what your thoughts is as far as zinc, because we've been talking about nutrients and whatnot, and there's some folks that I've learned quite a bit from, that have had some pretty good success in the industry, talking about the advantages that they've seen by taking their zinc dosage to the cold side. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah. Shout out White Labs for selling sterile zinc solution. That was genius.
I saw you start smiling.
No disrespect. That was genius. Sure, the margins are awesome.
But yes. I enjoyed that, if you can't tell. But yeah. Oh, and so another layer on it. So I know that when I know some folks that have had their wort tested, when they do all of their nutrient on the hot side, and they seem to get results that say that they're at least leaving a portion of that behind, potentially in the trub, in the break material. So yeah, that kind of rounds out that question, because it sounds like what could potentially be happening is people think they're getting X amount of zinc through their hot side addition, but they're potentially getting as little as 50% of that because of hang up in the trub. Is that nonsense, or?
No, that's not nonsense at all. I mean, there's basically two schools of thought with zinc addition. One is, just dose it as a sterile solution into the cold side. That does work quite well. You can make a zinc sulfate solution and sterile filter it, use that. You can do it on the hot side too. You do lose some to the trubs. So the other school of thought is overbuild the zinc in the hot side, because at the end of the day, it's not that expensive, and have an assumption about how much you lose. And you might even lose 70 or 80% of it, but you can still dial it in that way too. We offer a nutrient product. It's called Yeast Lightning. That's like a mix of every nutrient the yeast needs. It's intended for the hot side, but it's also got extra zinc in there to ensure that enough makes it through to the final wort.
Sure.
On measurements. So yeah, different schools of thought. I mean, the adding direct zinc solution is definitely a good, especially if you're like a bigger brewery, where you really want that like absolute precision. I think that works too. Sure.
And this is a little bit of a spin off that, but Andy wanted to hear a little bit more about, and maybe this would be an opportunity to talk about the nutrient that you were just mentioning. But he says, can you discuss a target to aim at in regard to wort composition as far as mineral levels, fan, etc.? Now, for the average brewer out there, I can jump on whether it be BSG or Country Malt or LD Carlson, whatever you're looking at, and I can find several different yeast nutrients, and it can be challenging to know what exactly you need to be getting into that beer. So can you deep dive that a little bit for us? And then obviously you said your Yeast Lightning is kind of built around that as well. And also something else that just popped into my head, if we can fold in maybe talking about differences between all malt and then adjunct beers, because we both know that light lager pops more and more on the craft side as far as volume. So if we're tossing a beer around that's 30-40% rice, how does that factor in with those nutrients as well?
Okay, so we got a few different parts. I'm going to try to stay on track here, but
I'm sorry.
On track.
I get excited and I just start talking, so I appreciate your patience.
Yeah, no worries. Number one is like what is essential, what is important to have nutritionally for most yeasts. I think that there's a couple things there, and independent of style, and I'll explain some of the styles where you can run into pitfalls as well. So we have a few challenges with yeast management and nutrition in general. In that, I'll use magnesium as my first example. Too much magnesium in a beer isn't good for flavor. It doesn't taste good to us. However, that's what yeast wants. So humans, us making beer, we tend to prefer calcium. Calcium and magnesium kind of compete to get into the yeast cell. We like calcium because it helps the yeast flocculate. It balances flavor, etc. But the yeast really likes that magnesium. So that's the first thing to balance out. The first pitfall that I see in two particular styles, one being hazy IPAs, the other being lagers, is that in hazy IPAs, a lot of brewers will put in absurd quantities of calcium chloride because it softens the flavor profile. It reduces that perceived bitterness. It adds, perceived body. But if you add a ton of calcium chloride without adding enough magnesium that the yeast can import the magnesium it needs, you will run into issues related to magnesium deficiency. So that yeast might crap out before it's done. It might have a slow fermentation, stalled fermentation, more extreme hop creep, a lot of issues in hazy IPAs. So you got to balance the calcium there. The other one is lagers, because typically brewers are going to try to make the softest water possible to make their lagers. So if you're in a place where you've got hardish water, your typical strategy is you're going to end up boiling your HLT to drop out your permanent hardness. And then because you're probably used to brewing hazy IPAs, you're going to adjust your water with calcium chloride or maybe gypsum, and you're going to forget about magnesium. And when you run into the same problem where your water has no magnesium, lager yeast really needs that, and you're going to get slow fermentations, and you might get diacetyl issues as well. Fan is kind of the same thing. We have this, honestly, most worts in the modern age have enough fan, but it might not be the right type of fan for the yeast. It all depends on the type of malt. North American malt has a lot more. European malt has less fan by weight. If you're using a craft malt, you got to check the spec sheet from the supplier because they're all over the place. So that's an important thing to look at too. But in general, like most worts in the modern age have enough fan, but they might be deficient in other things. We've seen huge variability in vitamin content in different worts, and that can actually be really important to certain yeasts. Certain yeasts can crap out if they don't get enough vitamins. So all of these things are like part of how we developed the yeast lightning nutrient, is trying to develop a nutrient product that's specific to beer yeast. And for that product, that's the key difference. The yeast lightning is designed around what we know, what we've spent, years pulling at our hair, figuring out what beer yeast needs when you grow it. We've applied that to the fermentation side as well, and creating a tailored nutrient for the beer yeast that gives them what they need. And they tend to have a bigger need for the vitamins and the minerals than a lot of the distilling yeast and wine yeast that most of those nutrients out there are actually designed for. So that's my plug for that.
No, for sure. Is there a sliding scale with usage rate for something like that? Again, potentially based on whether it's an adjunct, non-adjunct beer, or a low gravity, high gravity beer.
Absolutely. So the more adjunct, the more you want to worry about nutrition. Although, part of the reason that American adjunct lager brewing makes sense is that you have this like pretty darn nutritious barley that then you cut with sugars to decrease the flavor production potential, which can help you make a really neutral beer. That's a really big benefit. However, if that yeast isn't getting the micronutrients, that can be a problem, right? In terms of gravity, that's kind of more conventional wisdom that's sometimes wrong, is, high grav beers need more nutrients. Well, you have to keep in mind that you're getting proportional amounts of nutrients from your barley itself, from your malt itself in a high grav. So typically like fan and micronutrients is like less of an issue for high grav beers, it's just a matter of making sure that you're pitching enough yeast to share the work. Whereas where we often see nutrition issues that devolve into flavor issues is in lower gravity beers, where maybe there's not enough FAN or there's not enough B vitamins or zinc, and then the yeast struggles. It can't make enough flavor, or it's making off flavors. So that tends to be the area where you can find the biggest improvement with nutrition is the lower gravity beers.
That's interesting. It takes my mind in a little bit different direction. You know, I know we talk about with malt, generally the darker it's kiln, the more it's roasted, you know, you're going to be losing diastatic power with that. You're going to be knocking enzymes out. Does this apply at all with what we're talking about right here as far as any of these nutrients? So if you have, if you're running a stout, these are made up numbers, I'm not telling anybody out there to do this, but if you're running a stout with, you know, 20% darker malts, roasted malts, different things like that, does roasting those malts or you know, putting a heavy kiln on those, does that impact the nutrient level that they're contributing to the wort itself?
Yeah, it does. Typically, the more roasted,
it does. Okay, that's interesting.
The less less nutritionally available it is. Like, you can even think of it in terms of the Maillard reactions that are making it change color. Like, what is that? That's amino acids and sugars reacting to form color. So your amino acids are bound up now. It's not accessible to the yeast. So, you know, all other things equal, the lighter the malt, the more nutrition we'll have.
Sure. So would you ever have a situation where if you have a, you know, and maybe this is just too weird of an outlier, but if you had a beer that was very specialty malt heavy, would that be something that you would be looking at adjusting on that, or only if you see an issue popping up?
Probably depends on the starting gravity and the concentration of specialty malts.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So another thing that I have that I've been doing some research into, listening to, practicing is the usage of what some people are calling like cone shaving. And so the general idea is you are gently dropping the cone of your fermenter at maybe 12, 24, and sometimes up to 36 hours post yeast pitch, you know, for tank full fermentation. You know what I mean? Conceptually, and this is what I would love to have. I would love your take on that practice, but also in my mind, what we're seeing is that anything that is hanging out in the cone of that fermenter at 12 hours is something that is not active. It's either going to be dead yeast, protein, trub, or whatever that you're then pulling off. Obviously, in theory, to the benefit of the fermentation. What's your thought on that practice?
I think it makes a lot of sense. So the first time I heard about this was from some of the California brewers, like Benny at Russian River, etc.
Yes.
I think it is. I imagine, I don't know if this is true. I imagine the concept is kind of derived from the same idea as this practice in Germany called Wort flotation, where you're doing the same thing, but it's the opposite around, where they actually bubble air through the wort. All the trub makes a raft, and they do that for a few hours, and then they rack the beer into the fermenter, leave the trub behind. So it's the opposite, completely opposite setup, where cone shaving, you're letting it settle and then racking it off. Flotation, you're bubbling it to the top and then removing it.
That's interesting. I've not heard of that before.
In both cases, it's really smart, because what you're doing is you're giving yeast access to the trub during its lag phase while it's growing, which is good. Trub is good for yeast, but it's also bad for beer stability later on. So it's one of these, yin and yang things again. Trub has more protein. It has fatty acids in it. It has a lot of stuff that's minerals. It has a lot of stuff that's beneficial to yeast. It's great to have the yeast go through lag phase with some trub in the wort. But once that beer starts fermenting, trub is a negative. It can be, those fatty acids will oxidize. for example, and that reaction of trub, specifically with hops, can cause off flavors like mercaptan, that kind of gasoline-y, sewagey kind of sulfur. And I honestly don't know if much science has been done on cone shaving, and in fact, a lot of the German stuff is very, very prescriptive without much science. But I think it's reasonable to say that you get that stuff, precondition the yeast with the good stuff. You take it out of there, you can get the best of both worlds in terms of better yeast health and performance.
Sure.
Without risking some of those, negative consequences.
Well, and Vinny was even talking about he was leveraging it as a way to get, when he was harvesting his yeast, he was getting, less solids. You know what I mean? A cleaner. He felt as if he was getting a cleaner harvest off of his stuff as well. I think that's really interesting. And if you could speak to this as well, when I talk to people about things like this, sometimes I get the response of, well, I don't want to be dumping my yeast out of the tank. And sometimes this is also attached to this notion of lager yeast being bottom fermenting. Okay. Can you touch on that a little bit? So like, would it be a concern for you at 12, 24 hours for cone shaving that you're going to be dumping the pitch that you just poured in there?
Yeah, let's be clear about the type of ferment, the type of yeast. Like if it's 12, 14 hours on an ale, then really that time point is probably more like 24, 36 on a lager, right? So I would be cautious with the lager because depending on the tank design and what you're pitching and how you're pitching it, you absolutely can have that yeast just drop to the bottom. And you don't want to just drop that yeast off before it's fully done growing.
Sure.
So giving it that time.
Is the yeast at the bottom when it's growing, or is it in solution?
Well, it's usually both.
Okay.
The whole top fermenting, bottom fermenting thing is like, it's not black or white. Like you do still get foam on lager. It's just that you have more of that yeast, at the bottom or in solution than an ale, where you will get that, crazy foam on top from yeast forming rafts and floating itself. In terms of, you can tell like trub and yeast look different too. So you can also kind of tell.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I
don't know how to explain it, but like they look different. They feel different.
Sure. Yeah, no. Well, it's one of the reasons why, I always like, even when I'm dumping a tank, I like to have a sight glass on it because I like to see visually what's coming out of that dump. And maybe that's just me and that's crazy, but I don't know. I'm a big believer in, even when you have, various instruments that are reading things out for you. And maybe it's because I've been such a, I've had such, some rustic brew systems to brew on. Just getting the visual and the touch and the smells, it's such a big part of it as well. But you're absolutely right. I like to sight glass that up just for that reason, so you can get used to what's coming out of your tank and figure out what it is. You know what I mean? Well, next up, there has been, we touched on, unhealthy dying yeast a little bit earlier in our conversation. And I've heard some say that getting yeast off the bottom of a fermenter is only a concern on the professional brewing side of things. Do you think that is the case? And basically, we're talking about pressure on that yeast sitting in the cone, and the difference in volume in those vessels. Can you speak on that a little bit and give me what your impression of that is?
Yeah, I mean, the key variable is time. If you're home brewing and you're leaving that on the yeast for months, then you're gonna taste it.
Sure.
Really depends on time and temperature. In terms of that yeast going through autolysis, the longer and the hotter the more likely that is to happen. And also pressure does certainly play a factor too. Although temperature is, I mean, in my view, it's pretty tertiary to time and temperature. I did do my master's thesis on autolysis in wine, so I've got some experience on this. But yeah,
sure.
I mean, even in sparkling wines, like the pressure is a thing. It does impact how the yeast dies and releases flavors, but it's pretty secondary to the other stressors. So at like massive brewery scale, pressure becomes a big thing, but like even at craft brewery scale, it's not a huge difference. So I would say there's a risk either way, so just as a function of temperature and time. It's a lot easier to oxidize homebrew, so you might not notice changes in flavors as much. Like that's one of the challenges with homebrewing is managing oxidation, and that's why pressure, fermentation, all these things are so popular now, because it's easier to make good beer in a professional brewery than it is at home.
100%. Yeah, it's more often than not, it's equipment that's made to make beer.
For that reason, really good homebrew is always. I'm always like super impressed, and I
yes.
I make sure that if I'm really impressed with a homebrew, I make sure I tell the person, because I'm like, this is impressive. It's really hard to do.
Sure. So we touched on some of this a little bit earlier, but I'd like to flesh it out a little bit more. I know that increasingly through my brewing journey, I've been digging a little bit deeper on pH and pH manipulation on the hot side. And I know just with anything from lager to hazy, people have different recommended ranges of getting that where you want to get that wort pH wise. And so it kind of brought up this question for me. What is the mechanism that determines how low yeast will push the pH? So I feel as if, like in the past, I've brewed some lagers that were, consistently dropping to 4.2. And I had started playing around with some pH adjustment post boil. And I was still, and it's a couple of tenths here or there, but I was still it wasn't creating a different pH number post fermentation, right? I was still hitting 4.2. Is there a range that the yeast wants to get itself to, or if that's making sense?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good analogy here, because like really what you're what you're running into is really you're seeing the impact of this being a logarithmic scale. So a pH, your starting pH in a wort, whether it's 4.9 or 5.4, the difference between 4.9 and 5.4 compared to 4.9 and 4.2 is basically exponential, right? So your starting pH won't really it will have some impact over your final pH, but there's so many other factors like the yeast strain, the temperature, the nutrition, etc., that will have a bigger impact, because at the end of the day, again, a 1 pH drop is a tenfold increase in acidity. So your starting pH might not end up having a very huge impact on your final pH.
That's interesting, because to me, in my mind, so you get, not that you might already be able to tell, Richard, but I might not be the most scientific guy on the face of the earth, but I was actually just thinking about those as just straight up units, but that's not really the case at all. You know what I mean? Like there's like you said, there's actually, those numbers are far more impactful the more they slide, right? It's not just a 1-for-1. That's interesting.
Yeah.
We see more and more enzymes hitting the market, and more enzymes being utilized by brewers. I know many of them are being marketed as a way of making a greener beer from an energy standpoint, but they also market, quality, quality, quality benefits as well. So, I'm curious about some of those, some of the effects of some of those things on yeast. You have ALDC out there, you have Brewers Clarex, you have a wide range of saccharification type enzymes, different things like that. How does that stuff play into or affect the yeast strains that we're using?
Yeah, I mean, the enzymes are, by their nature, typically pretty purified products. So you usually can't expect any like negative side effects. There's certain things that will interact between yeast and an enzyme if you're using one. I think enzymes totally have their place. It just totally depends on your beer philosophy and what you're trying to accomplish. Like, especially in the larger production breweries, enzymes have there's a lot of benefits there. There are some cases where I suppose it would have an impact on yeast. Like if you're using a amyloglucosidase to make a beer that'll ferment down to nothing, you're releasing a lot of glucose, so you're going to change the ester production. You'll make more esters in the yeast. So if you want a neutral beer, then like an amyloglucosidase is going to be a challenge if you're using it in the cold side or on the hot side, for that matter. ALDC is ALDC. It works great. It's cheap. It's going to get cheaper. Pretty good solution if you're worried about diacetyl.
From a brewer standpoint, do you feel as if using ALDC is cheating?
No, I don't. I'm sure there's some that do. I do think that there's a lot of scenarios where it's simply not necessary. Like it's totally simple to make lager beers and haze and IPAs. I would say those are the two most like diacetyl risky beers. Totally possible to make those without having to worry about ALDC, but like brewers often are really, really worried that someone's going to taste those flavors in their beers. So, ALDC is a simple solution to eliminate that risk.
Yeah, it is. And I know there's also strains being marketed right now that genetically will produce that as well. But it is my understanding that at least with some of those strains that they will lose the ability to do that over multiple generations. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, we don't make any ALDC producing strains.
Sure.
I don't have much experience myself, even with producing what are called transgenic yeasts, where you're plugging a gene in from another species or organism into the yeast, which is the case for ALDC. It's a gene from lactobacillus that's being plugged into the yeast. What often happens with transgenics is that because it is, a different gene that isn't normally in that organism, it might not be stable. The yeast might decide, well, why the hell do I have this enzyme? I don't need this, and kick it out. The gene editing technologies keep getting better and easier, but that is still a risk. And like from our end, just talking, circling back on, trying to have a different perspective on strain development. We're working on some ways to reduce diacetyl formation in yeast strains without having to introduce genes from other organisms. It still means using gene editing technology or genetic modification, but kind of playing around with the opposite thought process of like, what can we take away to solve this problem rather than what can we add?
Sure. It's wild to see some of the stuff that's going on. And one of the things that I do like is I do like, because I know Escarpment does and some others are too, I'm loving the amount of information that suppliers are starting to give us. So I'm working on a recipe writing workshop for the channel, and I was going to use some spec sheets for some Weyermann base malts. And I hadn't pulled one up in a little while, but I pulled one up, and it was nice to see that they list their saccharification time on there now, which something that hasn't always been listed on stuff. I always think it's nice to be able to get as much information along the way as you can. So yeah.
That's important. That's a big shift too. We used to not have any spec sheets for anything, and
Sure.
We've started to do that stuff, and also just try to put our available data into digestible formats. We have these flavor guides, for example.
Definitely. So let's talk about esters phenols, and this is something that it's an idea that I have in my head, and I don't know if it's wrong or not. A brewer buddy of mine, Chris, asked the question, and this might be specifically related to Saison, but he says, what moves the needle most for ester production? Oxygenation rate, fermentation temp, pitching rate. Same question for phenols.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a ton to
read our guide to yeast flavor and biotransformation, and all will be answered. Temperature is really important. So,
and where is that resource? Is that under resources
on our website? Yeah.
Okay.
You have to fill out a form and give us your email, and then you can download the PDF.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's near and dear to my heart. I love Saison. I'm more of like a mixed ferm Saison person, but I love it regardless, because of how expressive, how much freedom you have to play around with fermentation expression with Saison. What moves the needle the most? Temperature is huge. And it's not, it's not even the basic, wisdom of hotter is more. That's not actually true. For a lot of strains, you'll get more of the acetate esters, like your banana bubblegum, at lower temperatures, and you'll get more of the fatty acid esters, which is like your tropical fruit, apple, pear, orchard fruit, at higher temperatures. So you have that basically that knob you can turn, right, depending on what you're targeting. Obviously, that'll depend on other things too. Saison yeasts are awesome at biotransformation, so your hops play a role there too. Phenols is really just dependent. It's a pretty simple relationship. Some strains do produce more phenols than others. There's not a lot of published data on that, but every time we go and measure it, we see that it's not on or off like it tends to be presented by a lot of yeast people. Some strains can be more phenol producing than others, and the Saison strains tend to be on the high end of that spectrum. Phenol production is very otherwise dependent on the precursors. So your grains have different phenol precursors in them. Some have more than others, like rye has more than barley. Barley has more than wheat. You can control the phenol expression through the type of grains in your recipe as well. So if you want more phenols, I would go rye. If you want less, I would actually use, a portion of wheat in the recipe.
That's interesting. I've also, when it comes to the ester side of things, and maybe this is an oversimplified example, but I was taught that the supermajority of ester formation happens during the growth phase of the yeast life cycle. Is that the case? And is that why sometimes people will have, sometimes maybe they refer to it as a modified Narcissus fermentation, where they will pitch cold for a lager, aim for it for growth to happen at the colder temperature, but then slowly ramp that as yeast proceeds through fermentation.
Yep, and that's true. There's studies, that track flavor formation over time, and we've done a bit of that ourselves too. Ester formation is is a byproduct largely of the growth metabolism. You have fatty acid esters that are mostly the product of the yeast breaking down amino acids and making fats, making cell membranes, etc., making cells. And likewise, the acetate esters, those, banana, bubblegum, etc., kind of a byproduct of central sugar metabolism of the yeast. So those do tend to be produced pretty early on in the process, whereas something like phenols might actually be sustained over time because the yeast will just break it down when it needs to do that reaction for energy.
Okay.
Yeah. So esters, I would agree. Yeah, totally. If you want to suppress esters, start cold and raise it up.
Sure. No, that makes sense. I'm glad because again, even for myself, it's one of those not even, but like, yeah, I mean, 'cause you always try to check yourself as you're like, all right, so I've been thinking this thought for a very long time, and sometimes it dawns on you. It's like, well, wait, I mean, have I been right the whole time about this? Or so no, that's cool. I've been very excited to have this conversation with you. So anyhow, Chris has some questions about Kveik as well. Now, I ran when I was working at this very small brew pub. It was a Sabco 10-gallon system, so I turned it 3 times in a day to make a barrel. Totally worth it. But it was insane. Like it was the most like janky farmhouse because the farmhouse has kind of been memed out there a little bit. But like I had no temperature control. I was fermenting in plastic. It was wild. Don't get me started. But so I started saying to myself, okay, so what is something I can leverage that might allow me to make something that is drinkable in this environment? And that was when the content started breaking about Kveik and the availability of that. And I started trying to model my practices there off of the stuff that I was reading off of Lars's blog. Okay. So my buddy Chris asked, just because you can doesn't mean you should. High ferment temps with Kveik. I found my ideal range for Hornindal and Voss specifically to be in the 74 to 80 degree range, and that's F, of course. How much can you potentially, quote, blow out of solution, end quote, or gain unwanted phenol / esters when fermenting at 90 degrees F or plus?
Yeah, I mean, the cool thing about Kveik is that you get a pretty wide range of operational temperatures that it can handle compared to conventional yeasts. But that doesn't necessarily mean that one temperature is better than the other. So we've done some research on this, measuring the flavor production of Kveik yeast based on the different temperatures. And one of the opportunities is that it's almost like one strain can be completely different presentation at a lower temperature versus a warmer temperature.
Mm-hmm.
In general, for efficiency, they tend to be the most efficient at 30 to 40 C, like 90 to 100 F or so. 104, I think, is 40 C. But
which is such a bizarre concept.
Yeah, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best flavor for you. And the thing that I think is really useful and fascinating about Kveik is that you have this, it's like a chameleon based on the temperatures. Like the same strain to me will be completely different at 70 versus 90. Mm-hmm. So you can almost get multiple strains in one based on the temperature it ferments at. And like you lose some of the benefits in terms of fermentation rate at the colder temperatures. They start to look more like regular ale strains, but mm-hmm. It's nice to have that flexibility. I've heard lots of things about why the hot temperature is a bad thing, like blowing off flavors, etc. Like maybe, I would always look to what the traditional brewers do and how those fermentations work for inspiration. I've gotten so much insight about how to handle Kveik and how to help modern commercial brewers handle Kveik by learning how traditional brewers use it and really digging in deep. That's really answered all of my mysteries going over to Norway and talking to people. but I would say temperatures are a big one. You can also control Kveik flavor through pitch rate. You have a lot of options. I don't think that hot fermentations necessarily produce unstable beers. And we've been involved in some research on explaining why. I can't share it yet, or else the people at the university will get mad at me. But there's a really cool explanation for how Kveik can do these hot ferments without the beers, flashing off or oxidizing.
Oh, that's exciting. That's exciting. I'm looking forward to that. Because that was something that and again, I was just trying to mimic what I was reading in those blogs. You know what I mean? So it's interesting stuff. It's interesting stuff. You had mentioned or been close to mentioning a couple times maybe some of the stuff that you have going on the newer side as far as some yeast stuff. I believe I saw, I don't know if it's a collaboration, but is there a yeast release that you did with somebody that I was just seeing about recently?
Yeah, so this week we've released the official Pink Boots yeast here in Canada. So currently that's a Canada exclusive. We are making sure that we're in the running for being the Pink Boots yeast worldwide, including the US, because we're able to ship to the US currently. But that just came out this week. So Pink Boots Society is a organization, nonprofit that helps to provide resources and give community and give a voice to women and non-binary people in beer. We've been supporters of Pink Boots for a little while now. We most recently sponsored a scholarship to attend their annual conference. One of our people, Shelly, she approached them about doing a Pink Boots yeast because there's already a Pink Boots malt and a Pink Boots hop blend. So why not complete the full circle? The folks at Pink Boots Canada jumped on board. So we've made that available to brewers year round to access the Pink Boots yeast. And we're donating a portion of our revenue from that back to Pink Boots to support scholarships and operational activities.
Nice. Tell me a little bit about the strain. What's the strain like?
So it's a cool strain. So it actually is a strain that we've been offering for a little while as a private yeast that a few different breweries use. It's a Kolsch strain. So there's a number of different Kolsch strains out there. It's actually one of those categories where there's like a pretty good diversity of different yeasts. This one is kind of cool. I would say I would describe it as more of a traditional Kolsch strain. Like it almost presents lager-like when it's used in a Kolsch. It's got really good. It just makes, I don't know how to describe this in a Kolsch. It makes a very nice, crispy, authentic Kolsch to me. I can't confirm that it's the same strain as if you're like a Kolsch nerd like I am. I can't confirm it's the exact same strain as Pefkin in Cologne, but to me it presents the same way.
Sure.
Which is like a little bit more of that, like, there is like a hint of flinty sulfury that makes it feel a little bit more lager-like while still having like that, to me, like the hallmark character of Kolsch is this like white wine grapey characteristic. So it works great there. The other thing that we've discovered with that strain is it's awesome in IPAs. Whether you're going West Coast or East Coast, it's kind of a normal attenuation range, but this strain has a really, really nice biotransformation, produces some nice citrus aromas. Like, to me, I get out of any of our yeasts, I get the strongest like tangerine presence when it's in a hoppy base. So we basically present it as a dual purpose strain. You can make your lighter blonde ale Kolsch kind of thing, or you can make an IPA, or you can also experiment as well. Like, I honestly think that this strain would be great in dark beers too.
Sure. That's cool. And I think there's more elbow room and I was excited that you kind of talked about some of the range. Because I think sometimes I always say, well, oh, it's a Kolsch strain, we're going to make Kolsch with this. But you know, in my experience, you know, you can run a lot of different things at that, and there's some temperature range that you can work with too there. So yeah, that's very cool.
Absolutely, yeah, and like, you know, we want to help brewers get the most value from their yeast too.
Sure.
To answer the question in the chat, we certainly can send it to the States. So, you know, we're not the official Pink Boots yeast there yet, but you know, if someone's interested in trying out the Canadian one, then give us a shout.
Absolutely. What are some things that Escarpment has kind of on the horizon, some stuff that we can be looking out for from your team?
We're busy. There's a lot going on. We've been in the process of a merger with another company in Quebec that does similar things to us. So that company is called Le Labo Solutions Brassicole. They're a liquid yeast company, consultancy, etc. in Quebec. So, you know, we've been.
Do you speak French?
I don't. I need to get better.
No, dude, because listen, first of all, the way you just said that, I'm like, oh, guy speaks French. Because I was imagining having to say what you just said, and there is a 0% chance that it would go as well as that just did. So hat tip on that. But I cut you off. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You'll probably hear me say that and be like, come on, man. No, so yeah, we've got this project to you know, kind of join forces and be the best Canadian yeast lab that we can possibly be. So we're pretty busy with that, but you know, we do have a lot of R&D in the works as well. Lots of stuff happening. So we will be rolling out some more yeast strains and more like yeast support products, nutrients, etc. This year, and working on more stuff too. You know, we had our first partnership strain with Lallemand last year. The Pomona. So that strain was developed by us and then kind of brought to the big leagues by Lallemand. You know, they're able to make dry yeast and distribute it all over the world. So that was really our first crack at basically using our R&D and bringing it to a global yeast company and having them, you know, take it all over the world. You know, we have people in Australia and Singapore and all over using it, which is super awesome. So we might see more of that kind of thing too. You know, we have a pretty deep R&D program and research library, and like we're able to leverage that to develop new strains and, you know, hit at some of those niches that are coming up, whether that's biotransformation or lagers or non-alc and whatever else.
Sure. What's the best way for folks online to be able to track what Escarpment has going on?
We're pretty active on social media, so Instagram would probably is number one for us in terms of social media. So follow us on Instagram. We post a lot. Honestly, LinkedIn is doing great for us now too. So you know, you can always keep up to date with what we're doing on LinkedIn as well.
That's kind of a social media nerd thing. Range on LinkedIn is it's an easier place to get views for those people out there that are. It's a less competitive space for views in some ways. Yeah, there's some blue water out there.
It's bonkers. I got like 30,000 views this week talking about tariffs.
Hell yeah. Absolutely. And one last one that I want to drop your way, because I do like to just, I think as brewers, we all love the technical stuff, but I do think that some of the big picture career life stuff is important too. If you were to go back and talk to the younger version of yourself, you're in your early to mid 20s. What kind of career or life advice would you give to that man?
Oh man, how much time do we have?
You can go a couple bullet points.
Take yourself seriously, but remember that it's just beer at the end of the day.
Yeah.
You know, don't let that get in the way of relationships.
Yeah.
It's beer. We're helping people have fun.
Yeah. You know, a big shift for me was, and it was a very ego driven way of looking at things, but there's a reason that I talk about it frequently, because I think there's a lot of brewers that experience this, and in no way am I past it. But you know, when I first started doing my thing, because I taught for 10 years, I taught at-risk kids for 10 years, and then I got into the pro brewing side, and man, I wanted to win medals and be recognized, and you know what I mean? And I just had this goal of saying, oh, I want to make perfect beer, right? I just want to hit the bullseye all the time. And it would be completely ridiculous. Like, it would be like, all right, well, this is my second batch of Hellas ever. It better be perfect, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, you're just saying foolish things to yourself. And then, you know, quite honestly, it led to a lot of unhappiness for me, both personally and professionally. And I've kind of just taken the turn of, you know, and I kind of set as the goal of what I'm doing here with the channel too, is, you know, it's the point is to be aiming, right? You're always trying to get better. You know, maybe you'll hit a bullseye at some point, but that's not actually the goal. The goal is to actually just always be seeking that thing, right? Because that is definitely achievable. It keeps you hungry. Yeah. And it's a more enjoyable way to approach life. I definitely wish I could have talked to myself back then a little bit about it, but yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I can revise my answer too. Of, you know, I would tell my past self, like, you have to learn some patience here. You know, anyone who works with me knows that I'm a very impatient person naturally. But you know, you need to realize that 10 years in, you're not going to have the answers to all the questions, and in fact, you're just going to uncover more, and you're going to have a clear understanding of what you don't know.
Yeah.
But you're still going to have this mountain to climb.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. Well, Richard, this was a real pleasure. To everybody out there that's listening, please make sure to give Richard and Escarpment some follows on social media. You need to get over to their website and check out. Is it listed as resources on your website?
Yeah, it's all under there. You know, videos on YouTube, written stuff's on the blog. Just quick bites of information around the knowledge base. So yeah. three main places.
Yeah, absolutely killer stuff over there. You've heard me refer to some things with some of the other live streams and stuff that we've done. So yeah, you definitely want to be doing this. Richard, I have to tell you how much I enjoyed this. I love being able to chop it up with people that like really know on a level that, you know, sometimes the average everyday brewer doesn't. So it was a lot of fun, man.
Thank you. I appreciate that. This was a good chat. I mean, I don't always get these kinds of like super nerdy questions, so it's always fun to flex a little bit.
Well, I'm glad you thought that. I'm glad you thought that, because sometimes when I'm like prepping this stuff, I'm like, oh, well, these are always, you know, these are the questions they're always getting and stuff. And really, I just try to talk to people about like the stuff that burns in the back of my brain, and I try to connect with a couple other people. So I'm glad it was a fun chat for all of you as well. So anyways, we'll wrap it right here. Richard, if you just want to hold on for a minute, and after I drop off live, we can chat for a second. And everybody out there, appreciate you listening. I am going to be having probably closer to weekly Industry Pro podcasts coming up from here on out. So a lot of great content coming your way. Again, I'm genuinely grateful to see you in the chat, and please drop those comments and share with other brewers and beer lovers that you know that do me a lot of good. Anyhow, have a great day, and I will talk to you later.